The first heavy frost of the season came to Ellis County, Kansas on the third morning of November, 1973. It arrived without announcement, the way hard things always do in that part of the country, settling over the wheat stubble and frozen creek beds, like a white sheet, pulled up over something that had already died. By the time the sun cleared the eastern tree line, the temperature had not risen enough to matter. The ground stayed hard, the sky stayed pale, and Walter Briggs was already out in the machine shed behind his barn, his breath fogging the cold air, crouching beside a 1951 John Deere Model A that most men in Ellis County would have scrapped 3 years ago. He was 50 years old that November. His hands were the hands of a man who had never spent a single day of his adult life doing anything other than farming this land. The knuckles were enlarged from years of cold mornings and iron tools. The palms were calloused to the texture of old leather. He wore the same canvas work coat he had worn for 11 years, patched at both elbows with a different color of canvas that did not match. And he did not care even slightly that it did not match. The Model A needed everything. Anyone with eyes could see that. The engine was tired and burning oil, leaving a faint blue haze in the air when it ran. The hydraulic pump leaked at the base seal. The clutch engaged with a shudder that had been getting worse since August. The electrical system, such as it was on a machine that old, had developed the habit of failing at the worst possible moments, usually in the middle of a field with work still left to do. Walter had known all of this for a long time. He had been planning this winter for nearly 2 years, accumulating parts lists in a small wire-bound notebook he kept in the breast pocket of that canvas coat, writing down part numbers in pencil, crossing them out when the specifications changed, adding notes about tolerances and clearances that he had looked up in the service manual his father had ordered from John Deere in 1952, the year after Earl bought the machine. That service manual was held together with electrical tape now. Some of the pages were stained with oil and grease so old it had turned brown. Walter knew it almost by memory anyway. He had budgeted $420 for parts. He had the cash in an envelope in the kitchen drawer, counted out and set aside from the summer's receipts. He would not borrow a penny of it. That was not how things were done in the Briggs family, and it had not been how things were done since Earl Briggs had walked out of the Ford County Courthouse in 1943, holding a deed with no bank's name on it, having made the last payment on the original 160 acres, a payment he had scraped together through a decade of decisions so careful and so unforgiving of waste that his wife had once told a neighbor the man would sand down a used nail rather than buy a new one. Earl was gone now, had been gone since the spring of 1965, taken by the lung illness that had been working on him quietly for years before anyone gave it a name. Walter had been 42 years old when Earl died, already farming alongside his father for more than a decade already. The one who made most of the decisions while pretending to defer to the older man out of respect. They both knew how it worked. Neither of them said it out loud. That was not how things were done either. What Walter had not expected in those final weeks before Earl went was the conversation on the porch. It was September of 1965. The light in the evenings was still warm, but going thin at the edges the way Kansas light does, when summer has spent itself and is not quite ready to admit it. Earl was in the wooden chair he had built himself in 1931, from lumber he had milled from a cottonwood that fell in a storm. He was thin in a way that made his clothes look borrowed. His voice when he spoke came from somewhere deeper in his chest than it used to, as if it had to travel farther to reach the surface. "Walter," Earl said, "there is something I need you to hear before I cannot say it anymore." Walter sat on the porch steps and waited. "This land," Earl said, "these 400 acres, there is not a bank in this state or any other state that has a claim on a single inch of it. You understand what that means? You understand what it costs to get to that. Walter said that he understood. I need you to promise me something, Earl said. Not because I think you are foolish. I know you are not foolish. I need you to promise me because the world is going to tell you things that sound true and are not true. It is going to tell you that debt is just a tool. It is going to tell you that borrowing is how a man grows. It is going to tell you that the neighbors who are expanding are smart, and the ones who are not are falling behind. I need you to promise me that when it tells you those things, you will remember 1932. Walter remembered 1932 very well. He had been 9 years old. He remembered the bank officer sitting in that same porch chair where Earl was sitting now. A man in a wool suit who had driven out from Hayes with papers in a leather case. And he remembered Earl standing at the porch railing with his arms crossed and not offering the man coffee or a place to sit on the steps, just standing there until the man left. He remembered his mother inside the kitchen making no sound at all, as if she had stopped breathing for the duration of that visit. He remembered that Earl had stayed at the porch railing for a long time, after the man drove away, not moving, just watching the dust settle back onto the road. Promise me. Earl said that the land stays free and clear, not for equipment, not for expansion, not for anything. The land is the foundation. You mortgage the foundation. Eventually, the whole structure comes down. Promise me. Walter promised. 3 weeks later, Earl was dead. Walter had kept that promise for 8 years by November 1973, and keeping it had required a particular kind of stubbornness that his neighbors had begun to mistake for a character defect. The agricultural economy of central Kansas had been doing extraordinary things since the early part of the decade. Commodity prices were rising. Land values were climbing so fast that the numbers from just 5 years ago looked like a different era. Wheat had touched $5 a bushel in the summer of 1974, up from barely $2 in 1970. Iowa and Kansas farmland that had sold for $200 an acre in the mid-60s was trading at $800 and $900 in the prime growing regions. And in Ellis County, the talk at every implement dealer and every grain elevator and every table at the diner in Hayes was about expansion, about leverage, about the new era of American agriculture that was going to feed the world and make fortunes for the men bold enough to get big. Walter Briggs was not getting big. Walter Briggs was in his machine shed in November, rebuilding a tractor that was older than some of his neighbors' marriages. The First Meridian Bank had a branch office on Main Street in Hayes, a building that had been recently renovated with new glass on the front that reflected the sky in a way that made it look more important than the buildings around it. The branch manager was a 34-year-old man named Preston Holt, who had come to Hayes from Wichita 3 years earlier with a degree from the University of Kansas Business School, and a way of talking about agricultural finance that made it sound like a science that farmers had been practicing incorrectly for generations. And now finally someone with the right education had arrived to correct them. Preston Holt drove a car that cost more than most of his customers earned in a year. He wore suits that he had not bought in Kansas. He had a handshake that was firm in a deliberate way, the kind of handshake a man practices, and when he sat across from a farmer in his office and talked about loan products and leverage ratios and asset utilization, he had a way of making the farmer feel slightly backward for not having thought of these things himself. He had come to the Briggs farm twice already that year. The first time in early spring when the land was just beginning to show green. He had arrived without calling ahead, which was something Walter noticed and filed away without comment. He had come in his good car and stepped out into the mud of the farm lane without appearing to consider what it was doing to his shoes, which told Walter that the visit had been planned to look casual and was not casual at all. Preston had walked the property with Walter, commenting on the soil quality, the drainage, the fence lines. He had admired the wheat in a way that sounded like he had read about wheat rather than grown up around it. And then, standing at the corner of the east field with the morning light coming across the tops of the winter wheat, he had made his first proposal. "Mr. Briggs Preston said, with the land values in this county, right now you are sitting on an asset that is working at maybe 40% of its potential. What I am looking at is collateral for a loan that could put you in a position to double your operation inside of 3 years." Walter looked at the wheat for a moment, then looked at Preston, then looked back at the wheat. "I appreciate you coming out," Walter said. "You want some coffee before you go?" Preston had smiled the smile of a man who has heard this kind of response before and considers it a temporary obstacle rather than an answer. He left a folder on the kitchen table. Walter put it in the stove that evening without opening it. The second visit came in October, just before harvest, and this time Preston brought numbers. He sat at the kitchen table and laid out a sheet of paper that showed in precise figures what 400 acres of Ellis County farmland was currently worth on the open market. The number was $360,000. The bank was prepared to lend against 50% of that value, which was $180,000 at 8.5% over 10 years. Dorothy was in the kitchen when Preston put that paper on the table. She was standing at the counter with her back half turned, not looking at the paper directly, but hearing every word. Walter watched his wife's shoulders in the way that a man who has been married for 23 years learns to watch, reading the small adjustments that most people would not notice. "Mr. Holt," Walter said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I would like an honest answer." Preston said, "Of course." "When the markets turn," Walter said, "and they always turn, what does First Meridian Bank do with a farmer who cannot make his payments?" Preston began a sentence about loan restructuring and working with customers through difficult cycles. Walter held up one hand, not impatiently, just to stop the words. "What I am asking is simpler than that," Walter said. "I am asking whether the bank's interest is in the farmer or in the land." Preston did not answer that question directly. He said something about partnership and mutual investment and long-term relationships. Walter listened to all of it without changing his expression. Then he stood up and thanked Preston for the visit. Dorothy walked Preston to the door. Walter stayed at the table. He heard the car start and pull away down the farm lane. Then Dorothy came back into the kitchen and stood at the counter again and was quiet for a long time. "Walter," she said finally, "that is $180,000. I know what it is," Walter said. "There is things we could do with that," Dorothy said. "Calvin's schooling, new equipment. We could buy the Hanford parcel before someone else does." "The land stays free and clear," Walter said. Dorothy turned around and looked at him. "Your father has been gone 8 years, Walter," she said. "This land is yours now. You have the right to make different choices." Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he put on his coat and went out to the machine shed. Dorothy stood at the kitchen window and watched the light come on in the shed, a faint yellow glow through the dirty glass panels. And she stood there for a long time before she turned away. The machine shed was not heated. Walter had a kerosene salamander heater that he positioned near whatever section of the machine he was working on, not to warm the shed, which was impossible, but to keep his hands functional. The concrete floor stayed cold enough to make his knees ache after an hour of kneeling. His breath clouded the air around him and rose toward the rafters where it disappeared into the dark. He began with the engine. To pull the engine from a 1951 Model A properly required building a hoist from timber and chain falls. Since there was no overhead crane in the shed, had never been one. He built the hoist over 2 days, testing it carefully, before he trusted it with the engine block. When he finally had the engine out and on a workbench made from an old door on sawhorses, he began the process of disassembly that he had done in his mind dozens of times over the past 2 years. Every bolt came out and went into a coffee can, labeled in pencil with the location it had come from. Every part got examined in the light of the trouble lamp that hung from a nail in the rafter above the bench. The cylinder walls were worn beyond the tolerances listed in the service manual. The piston rings were gone. The main bearings were scored. All of it went on the list in the notebook. Calvin came out after supper most nights that first winter. He was 18 years old, just finished with high school in September. Not yet sure what he was going to do with himself beyond helping his father through the seasons. He was a quiet boy in the way that boys who grow up watching quiet men become quiet themselves. He would sit on an overturned bucket near the heater and watch his father work, asking questions when he had them, which was not often but not never. One night in January, Calvin asked why his father didn't just buy the parts that needed replacing and call it good. Why rebuild the whole engine when you could patch the worst of it and keep going? Walter set down the tool he was holding and thought about the question for a moment. Because patching and keeping going is how you end up on the side of the road during harvest, Walter said. If you rebuild it right, you know every part of it. You know exactly what it will do and what it won't do and what it needs and when. A machine you understand completely is worth more than a machine that's newer, but belongs to someone else. Calvin thought about that. What do you mean belongs to someone else? Calvin said. Walter picked his tool back up. Your neighbor's over at the Slater place, he said. Gerald just signed papers on a new Case IH that cost him $38,000. He'll be paying on it for 5 years, until he makes that last payment. That tractor belongs to the bank as much as it belongs to Gerald. Maybe more. Because if Gerald has one bad year, the bank takes the tractor, and Gerald is left standing in his field with nothing to pull his implements, and a debt that doesn't care whether his crop came in or not. Calvin was quiet for a while after that. Gerald Slater was 52 years old and farmed the land east of the Briggs property, 900 acres now, that he had picked up 2 additional parcels in the expansion years. He was a tall man, with a broad face and a laugh that carried across a field, and he had been Walter's neighbor for all of Walter's life and his friend for most of it. He had also, in the last 2 years, developed a habit of describing Walter's situation with a kind of cheerful bewilderment that was not quite pity and not quite mockery, but lived in the territory between them. Roy Decker farmed the land to the west. He was 48, ambitious in the way that some men are ambitious during boom times, which is to say, he could not see clearly enough past the present moment to imagine a different kind of future. Roy had borrowed $45,000 from Preston Holt's bank in March, and he had used it to buy a new John Deere 4430 with a cab and air conditioning, and to sign leases on 2 additional parcels of land that brought his operation to over 1,000 acres. He spoke about his plans the way a man speaks, who has confused one good season with a permanent condition of the world. In February of 1974, on a Saturday morning when the temperature had not risen above 12 degrees, there was a gathering at the Bob's Feed and Supply on the county road. The kind of unplanned gathering that happens in small farming communities, when men have nowhere they need to be immediately, and the cold discourages any ambitions that require being outside for long. 6 or 7 men were standing near the wood stove with coffee when Walter came in for a box of hydraulic fittings. Roy Decker was in the middle of describing the specifications of the new 4430 in a way that invited admiration. When Walter came in, Roy paused and then resumed louder than before. Walter Roy said you ought to come over and see what a tractor looks like when it was built after World War II. The men near the stove laughed. Not meanly exactly, but not kindly either. The kind of laughter that establishes which side of a line a person is on. Gerald, standing near the back, looked at the floor. Walter picked up his box of fittings from the counter and paid for them. He nodded at the room generally, which was his way of saying goodbye, and went back out to his truck. Through the window of the cab, He could hear the laughter resuming before he had started the engine. He drove home on the county road in the particular silence of a man who is not bothered by what was just said, but is aware that the person who said it believed it mattered. Walter had noticed that people who are very sure they are right tend to announce it loudly to rooms full of other people. In his experience, people who are actually right tend to be quieter about it, not out of modesty, but out of a certain economy. If you know something is true, you do not need other people to confirm it. Dorothy had left a casserole on the stove when Walter got home. He ate at the kitchen table alone because she had gone to her sister's in Hayes for the afternoon. While he ate, he opened the notebook and reviewed the parts list for the Oliver 88, which would be next winter's project. He added 3 items he had remembered while lying awake the previous night, and crossed out 1 item he had concluded was not necessary after all. The February that year was brutal, even by Kansas standards. There were 11 days in a row when the temperature did not get above 15 degrees. Walter spent those days in the machine shed with the salamander heater turned up as high as it would go, which was not very high. His hands cracked at the knuckles from the cold and the solvent he used to clean parts. He started wearing thin leather gloves inside the shed, which helped with the cold, but made the delicate work harder, and he took them off for the delicate work and put them back on for everything else. He took the engine block to a machine shop in Hayes that specialized in agricultural equipment. The boring and honing of the cylinder walls, the valve work on the head, came to $165. The oversized piston and ring set was another $65. New bearings, gaskets, seals, and assorted hardware brought the engine work to $280. Then the clutch assembly, new discs, and pressure plate, $55. The hydraulic pump rebuilt with a kit, $35. New wiring throughout, which Walter did himself over 3 evenings. Sitting under the machine with a wiring diagram tacked to the underside of the hood, about $30 in materials. The sheet metal work was the part that most people would not have done. The fenders had rusted through in 3 places, and a section of the hood had corroded to the point where it was more rust than metal. Walter cut the bad sections out with tin snips and fabricated replacements from steel he salvaged from an old grain bin that had been sitting behind the barn for 20 years. He shaped the new pieces with a hammer and a piece of pipe used as a dolly, fitting and refitting each piece until the gaps were consistent and the lines were clean. It took 4 times longer than he had expected, and the results were not perfect. But they were solid, which was what mattered. The total for the Model A rebuild came to $411 in parts and machine shop fees. He had budgeted $420 and had come in under. When he fired the rebuilt engine for the first time in late March, Calvin was standing beside him. The engine turned over twice and caught and ran, not roughly the way it had been running for the last 2 years, but smoothly and evenly with a sound that was almost surprising in its steadiness. Calvin stood there listening to it for a moment. "You did that?" Calvin said. Walter adjusted the throttle slightly, listening to the idle. "We did that," Walter said. Spring came to Ellis County. The wheat grew. Commodity prices stayed high. Gerald Slater bought a new grain truck in April, financing it through First Meridian at 8.75%. Roy Decker leased a 3rd parcel of land in May, 160 acres east of the county road, and talked about it at the grain elevator as though it were a victory in a war that other men were too timid to fight. Preston Holt drove past the Briggs farm one morning in June in his good car, and Walter, who was walking the fence line on the south field, watched the car slow slightly as it passed, as if Preston were taking note of something. Then it sped up again and was gone. That summer, Calvin told his father he wanted to go to Kansas State University in the fall. He had looked into it. There were agricultural engineering programs there that he thought would be useful practical things about soil management and equipment design that he could bring back to the farm. He said this carefully in the way of a young man who is not sure how his father will take it. Walter listened to all of it. Then he said, "What does it cost?" Calvin told him. Walter looked out at the north field for a moment. "I will have the money from this summer's crop," Walter said. "You go. You learn everything they will teach you. And then you come back." Calvin went back to the house. Walter stood at the edge of the north field in the summer heat and looked at the wheat that was still 3 weeks from ready, and thought about his father standing at the courthouse in 1943, holding that clean deed. And he thought about the machine shed and the $411 in parts, and the rebuilt engine that was running right now in the barn, doing what it was supposed to do. He thought about Preston Holt's car slowing on the county road. He put the thought away and walked back toward the barn. That fall, the second winter's work began. The Oliver 88 was in worse condition than the Model A had been. The transmission had been making noises since August, a grinding in certain gears, and a high-pitched whine under load that Walter had been listening to with growing attention. The diesel engine itself was not bad, better than the Model A had been, but the injection system needed work, and the pump was original equipment that had never been rebuilt in nearly 20 years of use. Dorothy came out to the shed with coffee one night in November. She stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold air coming in around her before she stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind her. She set the coffee on the corner of the workbench where Walter could reach it without moving, and she stood looking at the Oliver for a moment with her hands inside her coat pockets. She did not say anything about Preston Holt or the loan or the neighbors. She just looked at the tractor, and then at her husband lying under it with a trouble lamp in one hand and a wrench in the other. "It is cold in here," she said. Walter said yes. Dorothy stood for another moment. Then she went back inside. Walter lay under the Oliver in the cold and listened to the kerosene heater and thought about nothing except the transmission he was going to pull the next morning, and how he was going to approach the disassembly, and which parts he suspected he would find worn beyond tolerance, and what the salvage yard in Salina had in stock that might be useful. He was a man who had made a promise to a dead man and was keeping it in a cold shed in November, while the world around him borrowed money and bought new things, and told itself that this time was different from every time before. He was not angry about it. He was not smug about it. He was simply doing what he believed was right, in the way that a man does when he has stopped caring whether it looks right to anyone watching. The Oliver's transmission came out in pieces over 3 days. Walter laid every component on a sheet of plywood on the floor of the shed in the exact order of disassembly, making small pencil marks on the plywood to indicate orientation and sequence. He found 3 gears worn past acceptable limits. He found a synchronizer assembly that was almost completely destroyed. He found 2 bearings that were rough, in a way that told him they had been running rough for a long time, long enough that the damage had progressed to the point where any reasonable mechanic would look at them and wonder how they had lasted as long as they had. He ordered parts from the dealer in Hayes and from a salvage yard in Salina that specialized in Oliver equipment. The new parts and used parts together came to $290. Gaskets, seals, and fluids added another $42. Calvin was home for Christmas break and worked alongside his father for 10 days in the shed. He had been at Kansas State for 3 months and had come back with a slightly different way of looking at things, a tendency to think about systems and how components interacted that Walter recognized as the beginning of genuine understanding. They worked mostly in silence, with Calvin asking questions when he had them, and Walter answering them as precisely as he could. One afternoon, Calvin dropped a small spring from the synchronizer assembly. It bounced twice on the concrete floor and disappeared. They both went still and looked at the floor. They spent 35 minutes on their hands and knees, searching the floor of that shed. before Calvin found the spring in a crack between two concrete sections where it had wedged itself upright. Walter held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment. A piece of steel no larger than a thumbnail. And he thought about what it would have cost to order another one and wait 10 days for delivery during the middle of a rebuild. And he put the spring carefully in his shirt pocket and did not set it down again until it was back in the transmission where it belonged. The Oliver was running by February. The rebuilt transmission shifted clean through every gear with a smoothness that the original had probably never had. The diesel engine, with new injectors and a rebuilt pump, started on the first turn in temperatures below 10 degrees, which was something it had not done reliably in years. Walter's total for the Oliver rebuild came to $491. By the spring of 1975, Gerald Slater had borrowed again. A new grain bin complex, 40,000 bushel capacity, financed through First Meridian at 9%. Roy Decker had taken on a fourth parcel of leased land and was farming over 1,200 acres with 3 large tractors and a crew that in busy seasons grew to 4 hired men. Both of them were profitable. The numbers worked on paper in 1975. The numbers worked because wheat prices were still strong and land values were still climbing. And the carrying cost of debt, while not trivial, was manageable against the income those operations generated. Walter watched all of this the way a man watches weather, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, just with attention. That summer, Calvin came home for 3 months and worked the farm. He had grown into something during his year away, not bigger physically, but more deliberate in the way he moved and thought and spoke. He had a girlfriend, a girl named Patricia, who had grown up in Abilene and was studying agriculture economics at Kansas State. He brought her to the farm in July. Roy Decker happened to be passing on the county road when Calvin and Patricia pulled up in Calvin's truck, and Roy slowed and lowered his window and said something about the Briggs farm that was meant to be a joke. Something about the Model A sitting near the barn, looking like a museum piece. Something about farming in the last century. Walter was at the barn and heard it. Patricia looked uncomfortable. Calvin's jaw went tight. That night after supper, Calvin came out to the machine shed, where Walter was making notes for the third winter's project, the 1948 Farmall M. Calvin sat down on the overturned bucket he had been sitting on since he was old enough to sit without falling off it. He said it without preamble, the way young men say hard things when they have decided they are going to say them. "Dad," he said, "I was embarrassed today." Walter set down his notebook and looked at his son. "I know that," Walter said. "Everyone at school has fathers who are expanding," Calvin said. "Everyone at school has fathers who are buying new equipment and growing their operations and building things. And every time I come home, I'm the kid whose dad is in the shed with a tractor from 1948. Walter was quiet for a moment. "Sit down there," Walter said. He pointed to the floor in front of the Farmall M. "I want to show you something." Calvin sat on the floor. Walter crouched next to the Farmall and began to describe the machine, not its history or its sentimental value, but its mechanical reality. The engine, the transmission, the hydraulic system, the clutch. He described what was wrong with each system and what would need to happen to make it right, and how much it would cost in parts and how long it would take in labor. He described it in enough detail and with enough precision that it became clear he had been carrying this knowledge in his head, had been planning this winter for months, already knew every part of this machine, the way you know a thing you have studied until it stops being information and becomes understanding. Then Walter said, "Do you know what Roy Decker's monthly payment is on that John Deere 443? Oh, Calvin did not know. Walter told him. He told him the purchase price and the interest rate and the term and the monthly payment and what that payment would total over 5 years. and what percentage of Roy's gross income in a normal year that represented. He told him what would happen to that payment if commodity prices dropped by 30%, which they had done before and would do again. He told him what would happen to Roy's ability to make that payment if interest rates rose to the levels they had reached in certain previous periods of American financial history, which they had also done before and would do again. Calvin listened to all of it. Then Walter said, "The men who are going to be farming this county in 15 years are the ones who own what they have. Not the ones who have the most. The ones who own what they have." He picked up his notebook again. "Go get some sleep," Walter said. "We start on the Farmall in November." The third winter came. The 1948 Farmall M was the most complete job of the three, requiring everything to be addressed, because everything had been allowed to go past the point where addressing one thing would be enough. The engine needed a full rebuild. The clutch was metal on metal. The hydraulics had a pump that was nearly seized. The steering components had wear that made the machine track sideways without correction. The brakes were soft in a way that was genuinely dangerous on any kind of slope. Walter worked through November and December and January and into February, and it was the coldest of the 3 winters, with a stretch of 16 days in January when the temperature did not clear zero, and the kerosene heater in the shed struggled to keep his hands workable even close to the flame. He wore 2 pairs of gloves some days, the thin leather inside and a larger pair of work gloves outside, and he still had to stop every 30 or 40 minutes and go to the house to warm his hands under running water before he could continue with the delicate work. Dorothy brought him lunch every day that winter. She had stopped asking questions about the loan. She had stopped mentioning Preston Holt's visits. She set the lunch on the workbench and sometimes stayed for a few minutes and watched Walter work, and sometimes just left the food and went back inside, and either way, Walter knew she was watching the same thing he was watching, which was the world outside this shed, behaving in ways that they both understood were not going to last. The Farmall rebuild came to $488. In March of 1976, Walter started all 3 tractors on the same morning. He went out to the machine shed before dawn and started them in sequence, the Model A first, then the Oliver, then the Farmall, and he stood in the shed and listened to all 3 of them running at once, filling the shed with a sound that was part machinery and part something older than machinery, something that belonged to the category of things that work, because they were made to work and then cared for until they still worked. 3 winters, $1,410 in parts, roughly 1,800 hours of labor in a shed cold enough to crack exposed skin. Gerald Slater's debt service in 1975 had been just over $8,000. Roy Decker's had been nearly $10,000. Walter Briggs's annual maintenance budget for his entire fleet had never exceeded $2,000. And in the 3 years he had been rebuilding it, had been absorbed into the rebuild costs themselves. He did not have a term for what he had done. He did not think of it as strategy or investment or philosophy. He had made a promise to a man who was dying, and he had kept it, and the keeping of it had required that he understand every machine he owned well enough to fix it with his own hands and the tools in his own shop. That was all it was. He did not know yet that what he had built in that cold shed over 3 winters was not just 3 tractors. He had built a kind of resilience that could not be purchased and could not be borrowed and could not be repossessed, because it lived not in the machines themselves, but in the knowledge of how they worked and what they needed, and how to keep them going when everything around them was breaking down. He could not have known, standing in that shed in March of 1976, listening to those 3 engines run, exactly how important that would turn out to be. He put on his coat and went out to the field. The years between a promise kept and a promise tested do not announce themselves. They arrive wearing ordinary clothes, looking like any other spring, any other planting season. Any other morning where a man wakes before light and goes out to check the sky and reads nothing in it that should concern him. Walter Briggs had kept his promise through 3 winters in a cold shed, through 2 visits from Preston Holt, through the laughter at Bob's Feed and Supply and Roy Decker's words on the county road. He had built something in those winters that he could not have named and did not try to name, and now the world was about to tell him whether it was worth anything. The spring of 1977 was when the first sounds came. Not the kind of sounds you hear with your ears, the kind you feel somewhere in the chest. The way old farmers feel weather changing before the instruments register it. A low-frequency shift in the atmosphere of things that the educated men with their charts and their projections would not notice for another 2 years. Wheat prices had been softening since the fall of 1976. The softening was gentle enough that most men could convince themselves it was seasonal, a temporary correction in a market that had been running high for the better part of a decade. The elevator manager in Hayes told anyone who asked that the fundamentals were still strong. The loan officer at First Meridian, who was still Preston Holt, though his title had grown longer and his office had been moved to a larger room, was still approving agricultural loans with the confidence of a man who believed that land values moved in only one direction. Gerald Slater bought another piece of equipment in March of 1977. A used combine older than what he had, but larger, capable of covering more ground in a day. He financed $8,000 of the purchase price through First Meridian and paid the rest out of last year's receipts, which was a more conservative move than he had been making in recent years, though he did not frame it that way. He framed it as opportunistic, a good deal on a good machine. Roy Decker leased a 5th parcel that spring, 120 acres, along the North County Road, that had been farmed by the Hanson family until the elder Hanson had a stroke in January, and his sons, who had moved to Wichita and Denver, had no interest in the land beyond what it could generate for them as a lease. Roy signed a 3-year lease at rates that made sense if wheat stayed where it was, and made much less sense if wheat fell further, which it did. Walter planted his 400 acres in April, the same way he had planted them every spring, with the rebuilt Farmall pulling the planter, the rebuilt Oliver handling the field preparation, the Model A doing the lighter work around the perimeters in the wet corners where the heavier machines left marks in the soil. He spent less per acre in operating costs than any farmer in his section of Ellis County. He knew this because he kept the numbers in the same wire-bound notebook where he had kept the parts lists for the rebuilds, adding a new section each year, with columns for seed fertilizer, fuel maintenance, and labor, and a final column for net income after all of it. The numbers were not large. They had never been large, but they had always been positive, and they had always been his. Calvin came home that summer for the last time before graduation. He was 22 now, taller in some way that had nothing to do with height, and he had developed the habit of asking questions that were better than the questions he had asked before he left. He spent 3 weeks helping his father through the early summer work, and then drove back to Manhattan for his final year. And Walter watched his truck disappear down the farm lane and felt something he did not examine too closely, a mixture of pride and the ordinary ache of a parent watching the distance grow. The summer of 1977 passed. The fall harvest came in at yields that were acceptable but not exceptional. Wheat prices at harvest were $2.40 a bushel, down from the highs of the previous years, but still workable for a man without significant debt service. For a man with significant debt service, workable was becoming a word that required careful definition. Walter delivered his wheat to the elevator in Hayes on a Tuesday in September, stood at the scale and watched the tickets print, drove home, and wrote the numbers in his notebook. Then he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers for a while. Dorothy came in from hanging laundry and saw him at the table with the notebook. "How is it?" she said. "It is what it is," Walter said. "Better than some years. not as good as the last two. Dorothy put the laundry basket down. Gerald told May that they are going to refinance the grain bin loan, Dorothy said. Stretch the payments out longer. Preston approved it last week. Walter looked at the notebook. That means they could not make the payments as they were. Walter said. Dorothy nodded. Walter closed the notebook and set it on the table. They ate supper and talked about other things. But that evening, after Dorothy had gone to bed, Walter sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, not looking at anything in particular, just thinking about the way a river looks when it begins to drop the exposed banks. The rocks that were always there but are only visible now, and the long, slow sound of water moving over something it did not used to have to move over. By 1978, what had felt like a softening began to feel like something more structural. The prime lending rate, which had been climbing for 2 years, crossed 11% in the fall, and the agricultural lending rates that First Meridian and every other rural bank charged their customers followed it upward, with the reliable obedience of a shadow following a body. Farmers who had borrowed at 8.5% on 5-year notes were now looking at renewals at 11 and 12%. The arithmetic of that change was not complicated, but its implications were serious enough that most men chose not to run the numbers in full. Walter ran them. He ran them for Gerald and Roy, both using the figures he knew from conversations and the observable facts of what they had built and borrowed in the previous 5 years. He ran them quietly in his notebook, without telling either man what he was doing, because it was not his place to tell them, and because men in the middle of a position they have committed to do not generally welcome an accurate description of what that position looks like from the outside. What the numbers showed was not catastrophic in 1978, not yet. But they showed a margin that was narrowing on both sides simultaneously, income falling as prices softened, costs rising as interest rates climbed, with no mechanism to adjust either trend other than time and hope, which are not reliable tools in agricultural finance. Gerald came over on a Sunday afternoon in October, the first time he had come to the Briggs place in what felt to Walter like more than a year. He came without calling ahead the way old friends used to visit, before the telephone made it easy to do otherwise, and Walter found him standing at the gate to the machine yard, with his hands in his pockets looking at the 3 rebuilt tractors, the way a man looks at something he is trying to read. They walked the south field together. The wheat was in the ground already, the October planting settling into the soil for its long winter. Neither man said anything that was directly about money for the first 20 minutes. They talked about the weather and the soil conditions and a broken culvert on the county road that the township had been promising to fix for 6 months. Then Gerald stopped walking and looked at the eastern horizon. I am paying $1,200 a month to the bank, Gerald said. Just in equipment notes, not counting the bin loan. Walter did not say anything. Last year that was manageable, Gerald said. This year it is getting to where I have to think about it. If prices stay where they are through next spring, it is going to be more than thinking about it. Walter looked at the wheat stubble under their feet. What did Preston say? Walter said. Gerald made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Preston says the market fundamentals are still solid, and that this is a temporary correction, and that the bank is committed to working with its agricultural customers through normal market cycles, Walter said. Did he use those exact words? Gerald looked at him. Nearly, Gerald said. They stood in the field for a while longer. Then they walked back, and Gerald got in his truck and drove east toward his property. And Walter watched the truck until it was gone, and then stood there a minute more looking at the place where it had been. That winter was the 3rd winter since the rebuilds, and for the first time in 3 years, Walter was not spending his evenings in the machine shed doing major work. The machines did not need it. They ran the way rebuilt machines run when the work has been done correctly, with a steadiness and reliability that had come to feel unremarkable because Walter had trained himself to expect it, which was exactly the point of having done it properly in the first place. He used the winter evenings to go through every system, on every machine, with a thoroughness that was more like inspection than repair, checking clearances and fluid levels and hose conditions and electrical connections, making small adjustments and noting anything that might need attention before the spring work began. It was the kind of maintenance that took a few hours and prevented a few $100s of repair, and it was the kind of maintenance that men who leased their equipment from the bank tended not to do, because the sense of ownership required to motivate that level of care was exactly what financing made difficult. Calvin graduated from Kansas State University in May of 1979 with a degree in agricultural engineering. He came home for a week after the ceremony, staying in his old room eating Dorothy's cooking, with the specific appetite of a young man who has been living on cafeteria food for 4 years. He had a job offer from an agricultural equipment company in Salina that wanted to use his knowledge of soil management systems and precision field mapping, which were technologies that were just beginning to find their way into practical farm use. He and Walter sat on the porch one evening during that week and talked about it. Calvin wanted to take the job. He thought it would give him knowledge and experience that would be useful when he eventually came back to the farm. Walter thought this was correct reasoning and said so. He also said, without making it into a condition, that whenever Calvin was ready to come back, there would be work here that needed doing, and a place here that would be his. Calvin took the job. He drove to Salina in June and did not come back except for holidays and the occasional weekend for the next 3 years, which was not indifference but the ordinary math of a young man building something of his own in a world that was beginning to change in ways that neither he nor his father fully understood yet. The summer of 1979 was dry, not catastrophically dry, not the kind of dry that made headlines and brought relief committees, but dry enough to reduce yields across Ellis County by 15 to 20%, below what a normal summer would have produced. Combined with wheat prices that had continued their gradual decline, the summer of 1979 produced gross income numbers for most Ellis County operations that were noticeably lower than the previous 3 years. For Walter, who had no debt service and minimal operating costs, the reduced income was uncomfortable but manageable. His net that year was lower than it had been in 1976, but it was still positive, and it still covered his living expenses and his operating costs for the following year, with a remainder that went into the savings account at the Savings and Loan in Hayes, where he had been depositing small amounts since 1967. For Gerald and Roy, the summer of 1979 was the beginning of a different arithmetic. Their gross income dropped by roughly the same percentage as Walter's, but their fixed costs, the debt service that continued regardless of what the weather did or what the market did not drop at all. The margin that had been narrowing for 2 years got narrower. The math that had worked at $3 wheat and 8% interest was not working at $2.20 wheat and 12% interest, and what was coming next would make those numbers look almost comfortable by comparison. In September of 1979, the Federal Reserve, under its new chairman, began a campaign of interest rate increases that would become the most severe monetary tightening in American history since the Great Depression. By the end of 1979, the prime rate had reached 14%. By March of 1980, it had crossed 17. By June of 1980, it was at 20%, a number that most agricultural lenders in Kansas had never expected to see in their working lives, and that their loan portfolios were almost entirely unprepared for. Walter learned about the rate increases from the radio, from the weekly paper, and from the conversations at the grain elevator and the co-op that shifted in tone through that fall from cautious to worried, to something that did not quite have a name yet, but lived in the same territory as fear. He did not say "I told you so" to anyone. It was not in his character to say it, and beyond that he understood that the men who were now in difficulty had not made reckless decisions in bad faith. They had made decisions that looked reasonable given what the world looked like in 1973 and 1974 and 1975. The world had changed and the decisions had not changed with it. And the gap between those two things was now a problem that no amount of reasonableness could close. The Soviet grain embargo came in January of 1980, a political response to the invasion of Afghanistan that removed one of the largest buyers of American wheat from the export market, essentially overnight. Wheat prices, which had already been trending down, fell sharply. By spring of 1980, they were at levels that made the already difficult math of leveraged Ellis County farming into something approaching impossible. Roy Decker's John Deere 443-0 threw a hydraulic pump in the first week of July 1980. It was the worst possible time, the beginning of the wheat harvest, that would determine whether Roy could make his August loan payment. The nearest dealer was 40 miles east in Salina. The pump was not in stock and had to be ordered from a distribution center in Kansas City. Roy was told it would be 3 days, minimum possibly 5. It was 4 days. During those 4 days, Roy lost nearly 300 acres of wheat to over-ripening. The wheat that he finally harvested came in at lower test weight than wheat cut at the right time, which reduced both the yield and the price he received for it. The total loss from those 4 days was somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000, a number that Roy calculated and recalculated over the following weeks with the obsessive precision of a man trying to find an error in arithmetic that is not actually there. He could not afford a 4-day breakdown. He had built an operation that required everything to work all the time, and when something stopped working, the cost of that stoppage was not just the repair, but the cascading effect on everything that depended on that machine being operational at that moment. Walter had seen Roy's combine sitting idle in the field on the 3rd day and had driven over. He found Roy standing at the edge of the field looking at 300 acres of wheat that was past ready and a machine that was not going to move until a part arrived from Kansas City. Walter stood beside him for a moment. "Roy," he said. Roy looked at him. There was something in Roy's face that Walter had not seen there before, a quality of exposure, as though some layer of protection had been removed, and what was underneath was not what Roy would have chosen to show. "What are you going to do?" Walter said. "Wait," Roy said. "That is all I can do." Walter nodded. He drove back to the Briggs farm, hitched the Oliver 88 to the grain cart, and came back. He spent the next 2 days pulling Roy's grain cart while Roy ran the combine through the overripe wheat, saving as much of the harvest as could be saved. Walter charged him nothing for the time or the equipment. He said it was what neighbors were for, and he meant it. Though he was also aware, in a way he did not express, that the situation had just demonstrated something about the difference between owning a machine that you understood completely and making payments on a machine that belonged as much to the bank as to you. Roy thanked him on the second evening, standing in the dust of the field, with the last of the wheat in the bin and the light going orange behind the tree line. "I appreciate it," Roy said. "I will not forget it." Walter said he was welcome. Then he drove the Oliver home and checked the hydraulic system carefully before he put it away, the way you check a machine after you have pushed it, running his hands along the hoses looking for any sign of seeping, finding nothing. By fall of 1980, Gerald Slater's operation was in what the bank would describe, in the careful language of financial institutions, as a period of financial stress. In the language that May Slater used when she talked to Dorothy over coffee in the Briggs kitchen in October, it was something more direct. "We are behind," May said. "We are behind, and it is not getting better." Dorothy sat across from May at the kitchen table and listened. May was a practical woman, not given to self-pity or dramatic expression, which made the flatness of her voice as she described the situation more affecting than crying would have been. She talked about the refinancing they had done, the extended payment terms that had reduced the monthly amount, but increased the total interest over the life of the loans. She talked about the conversation Gerald had had with Preston in September, which had been polite but had contained in its politeness an implication that politeness would not extend indefinitely. After May left, Dorothy washed the coffee cups and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the machine yard, where the 3 tractors sat in the afternoon light. She did not say anything to Walter that evening about the conversation. She did not say anything for several days. Then, one morning at breakfast, she sat down across from him and set her hands flat on the table in a way that meant she had decided to say something. "Walter," she said, "I want to tell you that I was wrong." Walter looked at her. "About the loan," Dorothy said. "About Preston and the money. I thought you were holding on to something that had stopped making sense. I thought the promise to your father was something you were using to keep yourself from being afraid of change. I was wrong about what you were afraid of. You were not afraid of anything. You just saw it differently than I did." Walter looked at his coffee. "You were not wrong to ask," he said. "It was a reasonable thing to ask." "I know. It was reasonable," Dorothy said. "Reasonable is not the same as right." They sat at the table for a moment without speaking. Walter finished his coffee. Dorothy cleared the cups. He put on his coat and went out to the machine yard. He started the Oliver 88 to warm it up for the morning work, and he stood beside it with his hand on the hood, feeling the engine through the metal, the steady, reliable vibration of a machine that had been taken apart and put back together by hands that knew every part of it. And he thought about May Slater selling the china at a yard sale he had not been told about. But Dorothy had mentioned quietly the set that May had gotten from her mother when she and Gerald were married. He thought about Earl in the porch chair in 1965. He put the Oliver in gear and went to work. December of 1980 came to Ellis County with a cold that had teeth to it. The kind of cold that made the air feel brittle, as though it might crack along the fault lines between warm and cold if something hit it hard enough. The prime lending rate had peaked in December at 20.5% and was showing signs of coming down slightly, but the agricultural lending rates charged by rural banks moved down slowly and reluctantly, like a man backing away from a position he had committed to publicly. And the relief that the coming reduction would eventually provide was months away and did not help anyone in December. Preston Holt had not come to the Briggs farm since the second visit in October of 1973. There had been no third visit because there had been nothing to visit about. Walter had not borrowed, had not expanded, had not given First Meridian Bank any occasion to be interested in him. He had paid his property taxes on time every year and kept his accounts at the savings and loan rather than the bank. And he existed from Preston's professional perspective as a non-account, a farm in his territory that represented no income to the bank and no risk. What Preston represented from Walter's perspective was a set of choices that had been made, and their consequences which were now becoming visible in the way that consequences always eventually become visible, which is to say, all at once after a long period of invisibility. Preston had not been promoted. This was something Walter knew from Gerald, who had mentioned it without emphasis in one of their conversations, the way you mention a fact that is relevant without quite being willing to call it significant. Preston had been considered for a regional position in Wichita in 1978 and had not gotten it. The reason, as far as Gerald understood it, was that his loan portfolio had begun to show strain at a time when the bank's regional management wanted to see evidence of sound underwriting. The agricultural loans that Preston had approved so readily in the expansion years were performing worse than the loans his counterparts at other branches had approved. Not because Preston was uniquely bad at his job, but because he had been uniquely aggressive in a market that had punished aggression. Preston was still at the Hayes branch, still in the same office which had not been renovated again. Still in good suits, though, whether they were new good suits or old good suits that still looked presentable, was something Walter did not know and did not care about particularly. What Walter knew was that First Meridian Bank in Hayes, Kansas had a loan portfolio that included several $100,000 in agricultural debt that was now seriously underwater, secured by land that had declined in value, and operated by farmers whose income had fallen below the level required to service that debt, and that the man who had approved most of that debt was still sitting in the same office where he had told Walter that his land was working at 40% of its potential. In January of 1981, Roy Decker missed a loan payment for the first time. He did not miss it by much. He was short by a little over $2,000, which, in the context of the $45,000 he had originally borrowed, was not a large percentage. But in the language of loan covenants, a missed payment is a missed payment regardless of the percentage, and it triggered a set of procedural requirements that Preston was obligated to follow, which began with a formal notice and continued with a request for a meeting. Roy came to the meeting. He sat across from Preston in the office with the good window that looked out onto Main Street in Hayes, and he explained his situation in the careful way of a man who is used to being in control of things and is working hard to look as though he still is. He talked about the commodity prices and the drought and the pump failure and the grain embargo and all of the things that had combined to produce a year that was objectively worse than any reasonable projection would have predicted. Preston listened to all of it with the expression of a man performing attentiveness. Then he said that the bank would work with Roy through this difficult period, that there were restructuring options they could explore, that the relationship between First Meridian and its agricultural customers was a long-term partnership that was not terminated by a single difficult year. Roy came home from that meeting feeling better than he had felt going in, which was the intended effect, and which would last until the second meeting 3 months later, which would have a different tone, because by then Roy had missed a second payment, and the word restructuring had been replaced in Preston's vocabulary by the phrase, going to need some additional security, which meant that the bank wanted Roy to put up more collateral for the same debt which Roy did not have, because the collateral he had put up originally was now worth less than it had been worth when he put it up. Walter learned most of this not from Roy directly, but from the texture of things around him, from the way Roy parked his truck at the co-op and stayed in it for a few minutes before getting out the particular stillness of a man who was gathering himself, from the fact that Roy's hired men had gone from 4 to 2 over the winter without anyone mentioning it, from the fact that the new grain bins Roy had planned to add on his east property were not being added, and the materials he had ordered the previous summer were still sitting in a pile near the barn, covered with a tarp that had frayed at one corner and was not being replaced. In August of 1981, the two things Walter had been watching for arrived more or less simultaneously. The prime rate, which had come down slightly from its December peak, began to climb again, reaching a second high of 21.5% in June, before beginning a more sustained decline. And the state of Kansas and federal agricultural policy, responding to the crisis that was now undeniable, began putting in place programs that were extensive and sympathetic and almost entirely too late for the farms that were furthest along in the process of failure. Dorothy went to see May Slater in August, a visit she made without mentioning it to Walter beforehand, and reported on afterward with a brevity that was itself a kind of report. She had found May in the kitchen. The dining room china, the set from May's mother that had been in its cabinet since the Slaters moved into the farmhouse in 1962, was gone. The cabinet doors were open and the shelves were bare, and there was a small rectangular mark on the wallpaper where the cabinet had stood that was less faded than the surrounding wall, which meant the cabinet itself was also gone. Dorothy came home and went directly to the kitchen. and stood at the counter for a long time, without starting anything, just standing there with her hands resting on the edge of the counter. Then she went to the machine shed where Walter was doing the fall inspection on the Model A, and she sat down on the overturned bucket that had been Calvin's bucket for years, and watched her husband work in the way she had watched him on the night she brought coffee to the shed. In November of 1975, the first winter of the rebuilds, she sat there for perhaps 15 minutes without speaking, and then she went back inside. Walter continued the inspection. He checked the clutch adjustment, which was good. He checked the hydraulic hoses, which were all sound. He checked the wiring at the main junction, which was clean and tight. He noted the findings in his notebook with the same precision he had always used, the same columns, and the same handwriting and the same habit of dating each entry. That evening after supper, without either of them having said anything about it, Dorothy took the notebook from where Walter kept it on the shelf by the back door and sat at the kitchen table and began to copy out the cost records from all 3 rebuilds into a clean hardcover ledger she had bought in Hayes, without telling Walter she had bought it. She worked carefully, copying the figures and the dates and the parts descriptions in her handwriting, which was neater than Walter's, and she added columns he had not included in the original notebook. Columns for the equivalent cost of equivalent new equipment at the time of each rebuild, and for the accumulated debt service that Gerald and Roy had paid over the same period. She worked on it for 3 evenings. Walter did not ask what she was doing. When she finished, she left the ledger on the kitchen table without saying anything. Walter picked it up the next morning and read through it with his coffee. He read every page. Then he set it back on the table and looked out the window at the machine yard where the 3 tractors sat in the early morning light, and he sat with that for a while. He did not say anything about the ledger to Dorothy. She did not ask if he had read it. They both understood what it said. By the spring of 1982, Gerald Slater's situation had reached the point that Preston Holt would have described in the careful language of banking as requiring resolution. In the language that everyone else used, Gerald was going to lose his farm. The process had taken 4 years from the first signs to this conclusion, which was perhaps slightly slower than some farms and faster than others, but was in any case a conclusion that had become inevitable somewhere around. The second time commodity prices failed to recover, and interest rates failed to fall fast enough to matter. Gerald had done everything the bank had suggested, had restructured and extended, and put up additional security and cut his operation to the bone, had sold the second combine and the newer grain truck, and let the hired man go and farmed 900 acres himself, with May helping with the equipment in the busy periods in a way she had not done since the early years of their marriage. None of it had been enough. Walter heard about it from Dorothy, who heard about it from May. And then a week later, he saw Gerald at the elevator in Hayes, and they stood together near the scale while the trucks moved around them. And neither of them said what they both knew for a few minutes. And then Gerald said it. "They are going to take it," Gerald said. "Preston called me on Thursday. They are starting the process." Walter looked at the scale readout without seeing it. When Walter said, 6 months, Gerald said, "Maybe less. They will try to work with us on the timing." Walter looked at his friend. Gerald was 60 now, 60 and looked older the way certain kinds of stress age a man faster than time does. "Gerald," Walter said. Gerald shook his head slightly, which was a way of saying that he did not want sympathy expressed directly, and that he had said as much as he could say without the expression on his face becoming something he would not want to display in a public place. They stood together a moment longer. Then Gerald went to his truck and Walter went to his. Walter drove home on the county road past the Slater property to the east, with its grain bins and equipment sheds, and the farmhouse where Gerald and May had lived for 30 years, and past the Decker property to the west, where Roy's operation had grown quiet, in a way that was more than seasonal quiet. A stillness that was the particular stillness of machinery that is not running because someone has decided. It does not need to run right now, a decision being made not by a farmer, but by a bank. He pulled into his own lane and drove past the machine shed, where the 3 tractors were. He stopped the truck and looked at them through the windshield for a moment. He had $163,000 in savings and certificates of deposit at the Savings and Loan in Hayes. He had 400 acres of land with no debt attached to it. He had a wife who had copied out his cost records into a clean ledger and added columns he had not thought to add. He had a son who was 27 years old and working in Salina and knew how to rebuild an engine in a cold shed. He got out of the truck and went inside. Dorothy was at the stove. "Gerald is going to lose the farm," Walter said. Dorothy did not turn from the stove. "I know," she said. "May called this afternoon." Walter sat down at the kitchen table. He opened the ledger Dorothy had made and looked at the last page at the columns she had added, at the numbers she had calculated in her careful handwriting. He sat there for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the machine yard was quiet in the late afternoon light. The 3 tractors casting long shadows east toward the Slater property shadows that reached almost to the fence line, before the light gave out completely. There are nights in the farming country of central Kansas when the silence is so complete that you can hear the land breathing. Not a metaphor exactly, but not quite literal either. The sound of wind moving over flat ground of soil, settling after a long day of sun, of whatever it is that a place makes, when the people in it have finally stopped talking and the machines have gone quiet, and all that remains is the fact of the land itself unchanged by the opinions of the men who work it. Walter Briggs had been listening to that sound from the kitchen window for 40 years. He understood it the way you understand something you stopped trying to explain a long time ago. The ledger Dorothy had made sat on the kitchen table through the last days of 1981 and into the first weeks of 1982. Walter did not put it away, and Dorothy did not move it. It stayed where it was the way certain objects stay in a house, not because anyone has decided they should stay, but because the decision to move them keeps getting deferred by the weight of what they represent. Walter opened it sometimes in the evening and read through the columns Dorothy had added. He had never been a man who needed validation from numbers. He had known what the numbers said before Dorothy wrote them down. But there was something in seeing them in her handwriting in her careful columns that made them real in a way they had not been real when they existed only in his own mind. Dorothy had believed in the other direction for a long time, and her conversion, expressed not in words but in ink on ledger paper, meant something to him that he could not have articulated and did not try to. In February of 1982, Preston Holt came to the Briggs farm for the 3rd time. Walter heard the car on the farm lane before he saw it. The particular sound of a car that was too good for a gravel road trying to navigate one anyway, and he knew before he reached the kitchen window who it was. He watched Preston park near the machine shed and get out and stand for a moment looking at the 3 tractors, the way he had stood in the east field looking at the wheat 8 years earlier, with the expression of a man trying to find the right way to begin a conversation he has been preparing for longer than he would like to admit. Walter put on his coat and went out. Preston looked older than Walter remembered. Not dramatically older, not ruined, but the kind of older that comes from several years of managing a situation that is not improving the lines around the eyes, that are not from sun or wind, but from a different kind of exposure. His coat was still good. His shoes were not appropriate for a farm lane in February, and he had clearly not learned this lesson in the time between visits. Mr. Briggs Preston said. Walter said his name. Preston put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the machine yard. "I imagine you know why I am here," Preston said. I expect I do, Walter said. First Meridian is going to begin formal proceedings on the Slater property in March, Preston said. The Decker situation was resolved in November. I am here because, in the course of reviewing the surrounding properties, your name has come up as a potential interested party in the Slater acreage, and the bank would like to know whether you want the opportunity to make an offer before we take it to public auction. Walter looked at him. You drove out here to give me the first look at Gerald's land, Walter said. We are trying to handle these transitions in a way that is best for the community, Preston said. Walter was quiet for a moment. Preston Walter said, and it was the first time he had used the man's given name directly, without the Mr. in 8 years of intermittent contact. When you came here in 1973, and again in 1974, you told me I was letting my assets work at 40% of their potential. You told me that the farmers who were going to succeed were the ones who understood leverage and growth. Do you remember saying those things? Preston looked at the machine shed. Markets change, Mr. Briggs, Preston said. Yes, Walter said. They do. I told you that in 1974. You did not put much weight on it at the time. Preston did not answer that. Walter looked at the Slater land through the bare tree line to the east, the top of Gerald's grain bins visible above the trees in the cold gray morning. What is the bank asking for? The Slater acres, Walter said. Preston told him. The number per acre was less than a quarter of what that land had been valued at in 1979. Walter nodded slowly. He looked at Preston one more time with the level, unhurried attention of a man who has been right about something for a long time and takes no pleasure in it. I will need a few days, Walter said. Preston said, of course. He gave Walter a card with a phone number on it and got back in his car and drove down the farm lane. And Walter stood and watched him go, and then stood for a while after the car was gone, looking at the place on the lane where the tire tracks were still visible in the soft ground. He went inside and called Calvin and Selina. The conversation was not long. Walter laid out the facts as he understood them. The price the bank was asking the acreage involved the timeline. Calvin listened without interrupting, which was something he had inherited or learned. Walter was not sure which. How much of the savings would it take, Calvin said. Most of it, Walter said. About $120,000 for 320 acres at the price they are asking. I would keep the rest as operating reserve. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Is it good land? Calvin said. It is Gerald's land, Walter said. Gerald farmed it right for 30 years. It is good land. Another pause. Dad, Calvin said, do it. Walter said he would think on it overnight. He did think on it overnight, sitting with Dorothy at the kitchen table after supper. Not arguing about it or analyzing it at length, but sitting with it the way you sit with something that you have already mostly decided, but want to be sure you have given the weight of a full night to. Dorothy did not say much. She refilled his coffee once without being asked. Near 10 o'clock, she said that the land had been farmed right, and that a man who understood the land it sat on would do right by it. And Walter said that was his thinking too. He called Preston the next morning and agreed to the terms. The closing happened in March of 1982 in a conference room at First Meridian Bank in Hayes, which was the same building with the glass front that Walter had driven past hundreds of times in 8 years without entering. The room had a long table and chairs that were better than necessary, and a window that looked out onto Main Street. Walter sat on one side of the table with a check drawn on his account at the Savings and Loan. The bank's representatives sat on the other side with their documents. Gerald was not there. Walter had called him before the closing to tell him what was happening, and Gerald had said he was glad it was Walter and not someone else. And that had been the extent of the conversation. because there was not much more that could be said about it that would not make it harder than it already was. Walter signed the papers. The check changed hands. He drove home with a copy of the deed in the passenger seat of his truck. 132 pages of legal description for 320 acres of Ellis County farmland that had belonged to Gerald Slater, and before Gerald to Gerald's father, and before that to a family whose name was on a marker in the county cemetery and nowhere else. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel satisfied in the way that people who do not understand farming sometimes. Imagine a man feels when he acquires more land. He felt the weight of it, which is the appropriate response to acquiring something that carries history. And he felt the particular gravity of a responsibility that comes with land that has been farmed honestly for generations and now requires the same of whoever holds it next. He put the deed in the kitchen drawer where he had put Preston's folder in 1973. Except this time he did not put it in the stove. Calvin came home for Easter that year and walked the acquired land with his father. Over 2 days, going over every field and fence line and drainage pattern in the methodical way that Walter had taught him to look at land by doing it himself. Since Calvin was old enough to walk a field without stopping every 100 feet to look at something on the ground, Calvin asked questions that were different from the questions he would have asked before Kansas State. Questions about soil compaction patterns and drainage efficiency and the long-term effects of the tillage practices Gerald had used. And Walter answered them with the accumulated knowledge of a man who had farmed ground adjacent to this ground for 20 years and knew its tendencies the way you know the tendencies of a neighbor. On the second day, walking the eastern boundary where the Briggs land and the newly acquired Slater land met at a fence line that Walter had maintained from his side for 30 years. Calvin stopped and looked at the fence and then at his father. "This is going to take both of us," Calvin said. Walter looked at the fence. "I know it," Walter said. Calvin went back to Salina and gave his notice the following Monday. He told Walter by telephone, and Walter said he was glad, and Dorothy, who was in the kitchen when the call came, turned from the counter and looked at her husband with an expression that was the closest thing to uncomplicated happiness that Walter had seen on her face in several years. Calvin came home in June of 1982. He was 27 years old, and he arrived with a truck full of things from his apartment in Salina and a set of ideas about soil management and field mapping that he immediately began applying to the operation in ways that Walter watched with the particular attention of a man who knows that he is watching the next generation begin. Not replacing him. Beginning. There is a difference, and Walter understood it clearly enough that it did not trouble him. They divided the work naturally, which is how work divides when the people doing it respect each other's knowledge without competition. Calvin handled the planning and the field records and the increasingly complex decisions about input management that the new agricultural sciences were making available. Walter handled the equipment and the mechanical decisions and the relationships with the elevator and the co-op and the neighbors, the work that required the kind of knowledge that came from years rather than from courses. The summer of 1982 was better than the two before it. Not dramatically better, not a recovery in any headline sense, but better in the quiet way that agricultural years can be. Better adequate rainfall at the right times, decent yields, prices that were low, but stable at a level that combined with no debt. Service produced a year that ended with more money in the account than it had started with. Walter noted this in his notebook without ceremony. In the fall, Roy Decker's remaining acreage went to auction. Roy had lost the largest parcels earlier in the year. The leased land first, since those were the easiest to lose, and then the equipment, and finally the owned acreage that he had put up as collateral in 1978 when the first restructuring happened. What remained was 160 acres, the core of what Roy's father had originally farmed before Roy expanded and it went to auction on a Tuesday morning in October. At the Ellis County Courthouse, Walter was there. He sat in the third row in the same canvas work coat he had been wearing for years, patched at the elbows with the wrong color canvas. And he watched the auctioneer open the bidding, and he listened to the room. There were 8 or 9 bidders. 2 of them were representatives of agricultural land investment companies from outside the county. Men in coats that were better than the coats of the farmers around them, which Walter noticed without attaching particular significance to it. The rest were local men, some of whom Walter knew and some he knew only by sight. Roy was not in the room. Walter had seen his truck in the courthouse parking lot, so he knew Roy was somewhere in the building, but wherever he was, it was not in the room where his land was being sold. The bidding started at $200 an acre and moved up in increments of $10, with the 2 outside representatives pushing it higher than the local men seemed inclined to go. Walter waited. He had decided on his limit before he came, had written the number in his notebook, and looked at it for several days, had discussed it with Calvin and with Dorothy, and had arrived at a figure that was the most he could pay, while keeping an adequate operating reserve for the coming year. At $260 an acre, the 2 outside representatives dropped out, which surprised the auctioneer enough that he paused and looked at them. They conferred briefly, and one of them shook his head. The auctioneer looked around the room. Walter raised his hand. He was the only bid left. The auctioneer looked at him for a moment, then at the room, then back at Walter, then back. The land sold at $260 an acre, 160 acres, $41,600. Walter wrote the check at a table near the back of the room while the auctioneer moved to the next lot, and he folded his copy of the receipt and put it in the breast pocket of his canvas coat and drove home. He stopped at Roy's truck in the parking lot on his way out. Roy was sitting in the cab, not doing anything, just sitting there, with his hands on the wheel and the engine off. Walter knocked on the window. Roy looked at him for a moment before he rolled the window down. His face had the look of a man who has been sitting with something that cannot be sat with comfortably for as long as it needs to be sat with. Walter said, "Roy, I want you to know that if you want to keep farming any part of that land, I will work something out with you. I am not in the business of turning neighbors off their land." Roy looked at the courthouse building. "I appreciate that," Roy said. "I do not think I want to farm it. I think I need to be done with it." Walter nodded. "Whatever you decide," Walter said. He drove home. That winter, Calvin began mapping the combined acreage systematically, walking every field with a notebook and creating records of soil conditions and drainage patterns and the history of what had been planted, and when that went further back than any written record in Walter's files. He gathered some of it from the patterns visible in the soil, some from conversations with neighbors who had watched these fields for decades, and some from Walter himself, who knew things about that land that he had never written down, because he had always assumed he would always be there to know them. The mapping project took most of the winter. Calvin worked at the kitchen table most evenings, spreading out hand-drawn field maps and annotating them with information that he then transferred to a cleaner set of documents that would become the foundation of how the expanded Briggs operation would manage its ground going forward. Dorothy sometimes sat with him and looked at the maps, and she asked questions that Calvin answered carefully. And Walter, watching this from his chair near the window with his notebook, thought about the ledger Dorothy had made about the act of writing things down, so they could be read, about the difference between knowledge that lives in one person and knowledge that has been made transmissible. It was during this winter that Calvin found the water rights document. He was going through the wooden crate in the back of the machine shed where Walter kept the original property documents, deeds, and tax records, and the old survey maps that went back to the original county platting in the 1880s. Calvin had asked to go through the crate looking for historical soil information that might be useful for the mapping project, and Walter had said yes without thinking much about what might be in there, beyond what he knew was in there. Calvin brought the crate into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and began going through it methodically, at the kitchen table making small stacks of documents by category. About halfway through, he stopped. He held up a folded paper that was yellow, in the way of old documents not yellowed with age from original white, but yellowed in the way of paper that was already old when it was stored. He unfolded it carefully, the way you handle something that might not survive being unfolded. Dad, Calvin said. Walter came to the table. The document was dated 1928. It was a water rights registration recorded at the Ellis County Recorder's Office establishing that the property acquired by Earl Briggs in that year, described by its legal section and township and range, held a registered easement on Bluff Creek and its tributary that ran along the eastern boundary of the original parcel. The easement established the right of the property holder to irrigation and agricultural use of that water source in perpetuity, and it was recorded at the county level in the manner required by Kansas water law. Walter read it twice. Then he looked at the eastern boundary of his property on Calvin's map, the fence line where the Briggs land met what had been the Slater land. Bluff Creek's tributary ran along that boundary. The eastern 80 acres of the former Slater property now belonging to the Briggs farm drew from that same tributary. Calvin said slowly, "If this easement was never addressed in the Slater purchase documents over the years, and if the bank did not identify it in their title work when they took the property, then the value they assigned to that eastern 80 acres may have been calculated without accounting for a water rights encumbrance on it." Walter looked at his son. "How does that affect what I paid?" Walter said. "It means you may have paid for something that already had a prior claim on it," Calvin said, "which might mean the bank sold you something at a price that did not account for that claim, which a lawyer would need to look at." Walter sat down at the table. He looked at the document in his hand for a long time. Earl had registered this water right in 1928, the same year he bought the land the year before the Depression arrived, and changed everything. Earl had walked into the county recorder's office in 1928 and filed a piece of paper that established a right, not because he needed it that moment, but because he understood that rights that are not recorded do not exist when someone else decides they do not exist. Earl had been gone 17 years. And this piece of paper had been sitting in a wooden crate in the back of a machine shed for all of that time doing nothing, until a 27-year-old man looking for soil records found it on a Saturday morning and understood what it meant. Walter called a lawyer in Hayes the following Monday. He drove to the man's office on Tuesday and sat across from him with the 1928 document and the recent purchase documents and explained the situation as clearly as he could. The lawyer listened and asked questions, and then took the documents to examine more carefully and called Walter on Thursday. The lawyer said that the water rights easement was valid and properly recorded, and had not been extinguished by any subsequent transaction in the chain of title, which it would have needed to have been explicitly to lose its effect. The bank's title search before the sale had apparently not caught it, which was the bank's error. The practical consequence was that the eastern 80 acres of the property Walter had purchased carried a water access obligation that reduced its agricultural value relative to unrestricted land, and that Walter had therefore paid a price that did not reflect that encumbrance. The lawyer said there were two ways to think about this. One was that Walter had a potential claim against the bank for selling property with an undisclosed encumbrance. The other was that the water rights easement itself, now that the Briggs family owned both the land where the easement originated and the land where it applied, was effectively consolidated under one ownership, which resolved the encumbrance and increased the overall value of the combined holding. Walter asked which way he should think about it. The lawyer said, "Mr. Briggs, the way you should think about it is that your father registered a water right in 1928 that nobody looked for in 1982. And that right has now come home to the land that generated it. What you do with the bank's error is your decision. But the water right itself is yours regardless." Walter thanked him and drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the 1928 document and looked at it for a long time. He did not pursue the claim against the bank. He made this decision without extensive deliberation, which told him it was the right decision. The bank had made an error, but the error had not cost him money in any net sense, since the consolidation of the water rights added value to his total holding that offset whatever premium he might have overpaid for the Eastern 80. And he had no interest in a legal dispute with an institution whose employees were already managing a situation that had cost their customers more than it had cost Walter, which was not a reason he could have explained to a lawyer, but was a reason he understood. What he did do was call the county recorder's office and verify that the 1928 easement was still on the record, which it was, and have the current ownership consolidated properly in the county files, which took 2 weeks and cost $40 in filing fees. He put the 1928 document in the hardcover ledger Dorothy had made behind the last page of her cost calculations, which seemed like the right place for it. Calvin spent the spring of 1983 establishing new management practices on the combined acreage. He brought in a soil testing service from Manhattan that ran samples on every field and produced a set of recommendations for amendment and rotation that were more sophisticated than anything the Briggs operation had used before. Walter watched this process with interest rather than skepticism, which was the appropriate response to knowledge that was genuinely useful, and he asked questions about the recommendations that Calvin answered carefully and completely. And together they adjusted some of the recommendations to account for things. Calvin's instruments could not measure the drainage behavior in the northwest corner of the old Slater field during a wet spring, the way the wind off the creek affected soil moisture on the eastern boundary. The accumulated understanding of a man who had watched this ground through 30 growing seasons. The spring planting of 1983 was the first planting of the Briggs operation at its new scale, 560 acres under management. And it went smoothly in the way that things go smoothly when the people doing them have prepared carefully and understand what they are doing and have equipment that works, because it has been maintained by someone who understands it. Gerald and May Slater moved to Hayes in the spring of 1983. Gerald found work with an implement dealer doing mechanical work, and Walter heard from Dorothy, who heard from May, that Gerald was good at it, which surprised no one who knew Gerald. He came out to the Briggs farm twice that spring the first time, to collect a few personal items he had left in the barn the second time, for no stated reason, just driving out on a Saturday afternoon and walking the south field with Walter, the way he had walked it 100 times before. They did not talk about the foreclosure or the bank or the years that had led to it. They talked about the wheat, which was looking good in the south field, and about the soil in the northwest corner of the old Slater acreage, which Gerald knew had a tendency to pool water in a wet spring, and Walter now confirmed had done exactly that in April. Gerald, standing at the edge of that northwest corner, said, "There is a buried tile line under there from the 30s. My father put it in. It should still work if you can find the outlet." Walter noted this in his book. On the way back to the barn, Gerald stopped and looked at the 3 tractors parked in the machine yard. "Those are the same 3 you had in 1975, Gerald said. Walter said they were. Gerald looked at the Farmall M, which had been rebuilt in the winter of 1975 to 76, and had been running since without requiring anything beyond the regular maintenance Walter gave it every fall. "How much did it cost you to rebuild that one?" Gerald said. $488, Walter said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I paid $9,000 in interest in 1980 alone," Gerald said. on equipment I do not own anymore. He said it without self-pity. He said it the way you say a fact when you are trying to make sure you have understood it fully when you are going over the shape of it one more time, so that it becomes something you know, rather than something that happened to you. Walter did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not cost more than it was worth. Gerald got in his truck and drove east on the county road toward Hayes, toward the life he was building out of what remained after the life he had planned had come apart. Walter watched him go. The summer of 1983 was good, better than good, genuinely strong, the kind of year where the weather cooperates and the management decisions prove out, and the harvest comes in at yields that justify the work that went into the spring and the fall before it. Calvin's soil management program showed results that Walter could measure against his own historical records, and the comparison was favorable in ways that went beyond what either of them had expected in the first year. By fall of 1983, the Briggs operation held 560 acres under direct management, all owned without debt, and had a cash reserve that had been reduced by the land purchases, but was rebuilding month by month from the income of a larger operation with no carrying costs. Calvin bought the 160 acres Gerald's father had originally farmed in November of 1983 at an estate auction, using money he had saved from his 3 years in Salina, and a small loan that he took not from any bank, but from Walter at no interest repayable when Calvin felt it was appropriate, which Walter wrote on a piece of paper and signed and gave to his son, not because he needed a record of it, but because Calvin was the kind of man who needed the transaction to have a document. The land purchase put Calvin's name on a deed for the first time. Walter was not present at the closing, which had been Calvin's preference, not because he wanted to exclude his father, but because he wanted the experience of signing a deed without anyone else in the room who had signed one before. Walter understood this and said so, and the matter was settled without further discussion. They were farming 720 acres between them by the end of 1983. In the spring of 1984, a reporter from a paper in Hayes called the Briggs farm and asked if Walter would be willing to be interviewed about his experience during the farm crisis years. He said he had heard from several people in the county that the Briggs operation was one of the few in the area that had not only survived but expanded, and he was working on a piece about the farmers who had made it through. Walter said he was not much for interviews. The reporter asked if he could just ask a few questions by telephone. Walter thought about it for a moment. Then he said that if the man wanted to write about what had worked, he should write about the farmers who had kept their land free of debt and their equipment in good repair, because those were the two things that had made the difference, and that the story of how to do those things was not a dramatic story, but it was the true one. The reporter said he understood that, but could Walter say something about how it felt to watch neighbors lose their operations? Walter said it did not feel like anything a reasonable person would want to read about. It felt like watching men who had worked hard for 30 years lose what they had worked for, because the conditions that had looked permanent turned out to be temporary. It felt like something that should not have been allowed to happen, but that no one who could have prevented it had any interest in preventing. I do not have a quote for you. I am sorry I cannot be more helpful. He hung up and went back to what he had been doing. The article ran anyway without Walter's name, which was how he had intended it. A neighbor who had spoken to the reporter described the Briggs operation in terms that were accurate if incomplete, and the article was read in Ellis County and then forgotten, which was the appropriate fate of newspaper articles about things that had already happened. Preston Holt left First Meridian Bank in the fall of 1984. Walter heard about it from Calvin, who heard it from someone at the elevator. The reason given was a restructuring of the bank's regional operations, which was a way of saying that the loan portfolio that Preston had built during the expansion years had performed badly enough that someone had decided to stop associating his name with the institution that was still trying to collect on it. Preston went to work for an insurance company in Wichita, which was something Walter learned without seeking to learn it, and that he registered without comment. The thing about Preston Holt that Walter thought about occasionally in the years that followed was not his arrogance or his expensive shoes or the way he had talked about leverage and potential and the modern science of agricultural finance. Those things had been what they were, the enthusiasms of a particular moment and a particular kind of education. And Walter had never taken them personally. What he thought about was the expression on Preston's face on that February morning in 1982, when he stood in the machine yard and said that markets change. There had been something in that moment that was not quite regret and not quite understanding, but was located somewhere between them, in the territory where a man arrives when he has been wrong about something important for long enough that the wrongness has become part of him, something he has to carry around. Walter had not felt satisfaction at that expression. He had felt something closer to recognition, the look of a man discovering that the world does not operate according to the models he had been taught, that the maps he had been given did not match the territory that the confidence he had mistaken for knowledge had been. In the end, just confidence. It was a look Walter had worked all his life to avoid wearing. By 1985, when the worst of the farm crisis had passed, in the way that crises pass, not by resolution exactly, but by the gradual exhaustion of their capacity to damage the Briggs operation, was farming 720 acres. All of it without debt. All of it equipped with machines that Walter and Calvin between them could repair with the tools in their own shop. A shop that had grown since the winters in the unheated shed, that now had a proper lift and an air compressor and an acetylene rig and a workbench that was solid and level and lit by electric lights rather than a trouble lamp hanging from a nail. They had added a newer tractor in 1983. A used John Deere 424. Oh, that Calvin had found at an auction in Salina, and that Walter had gone over thoroughly before agreeing to buy it. Pulling the inspection covers and checking the cylinder compression, and going through the hydraulic system and the transmission looking for the kind of wear that tells you what a machine has been through. The machine was sound. They paid $11,000 for it in cash, and it was working the day after they brought it home. The 3 rebuilt tractors from the winters were still in service. The Model A handled light work around the property. The Oliver 88 was still reliable in the fields, its rebuilt transmission shifting clean after 8 years since the winter that Calvin had spent 40 minutes on his hands and knees, looking for a drop spring on a concrete floor. The Farmall M had given 15 years of reliable work since the 1975 rebuild and showed no signs of requiring anything beyond the regular care Walter gave it each fall. The value of those machines was not their auction price, though their auction price when the time came would be better than anyone who knew what Walter had paid to rebuild them would expect. Their value was the years of work they had done without incident, the harvests they had made possible, the costs they had not incurred, and the knowledge that building and maintaining them had created in the man who had done that work and the son who had learned from watching him do it. Calvin married in 1986. Patricia, who had studied agricultural economics at Kansas State and had been part of Calvin's life since the early years of his degree, moved to the Briggs farm from Abilene, where she had been working for a county extension office. She came into the operation with knowledge that complemented what was already there, an understanding of markets and policy and the economic frameworks that Calvin's engineering background did not cover, and she sat at the kitchen table that first winter with Calvin's field maps and Dorothy's ledger and began building a financial planning system for the operation that was more systematic than anything Walter had ever used. Walter watched her work at the table where he had read the 1928 water rights document and where Dorothy had copied his parts records into clean columns. And he thought about the things that accumulate in a family over generations, Not just land and equipment, but ways of thinking and habits of recording, and the understanding that what is written down can outlast the person who wrote it. Dorothy taught Patricia the kitchen garden and the preserving and the particular ways that the Briggs household had managed the domestic economy of farming through the lean years. The habits of frugality that were not deprivation, but a kind of discipline, the understanding that a dollar not spent on something unnecessary was a dollar that existed when it was needed. Patricia listened to all of it with the attention of someone who understood that she was receiving something, and Dorothy, watching her listen, began to look the way she had looked when Calvin brought her home. For the first time, the expression of a woman who sees that the thing she has been building has a future in hands that are capable of it. In the fall of 1988, Walter turned 65. Calvin had been farming alongside him for 6 years by then, and the division of the operation between them had reached a natural equilibrium, with Calvin increasingly responsible for the decisions that required planning over years, and Walter increasingly focused on the work that required knowing a specific piece of ground or a specific machine with a depth that only time produces. He still did his own equipment maintenance. He still walked his fields in the early morning before the work of the day began, reading the soil and the crop, the way he had read it for 40 years. The way his father had read it before him. He still kept his notebook, adding entries in the same handwriting, dating each entry, recording the things that happened and the costs and the yields and the decisions and their outcomes. The long record of a life spent paying attention to the same few hundred acres of central Kansas ground. One October morning, he walked the fence line between the original Briggs property and the old Slater land. The fence he had maintained from his side for 30 years, before the boundary between my side and your side ceased to have meaning. The fence was in good condition. He checked each post and each wire the way his father had taught him to check a fence, which was by putting your hand on it rather than just looking at it, because a fence that looks sound from a distance can be rotten at the base, where the ground meets the post, and you do not discover this by looking. He found 2 posts that needed resetting and marked them in his notebook. Standing at the eastern boundary of his property, looking out over 720 acres of Ellis County ground that carried no debt and no mortgage, and no bank's name on any document pertaining to it, Walter Briggs felt something that he would not have called pride, because the word was too small for what it was, and would not have called satisfaction, because that word implied conclusion, and the work was not concluded, had never been concluded, would not be concluded until he was not there to continue it. What he felt was closer to the thing Earl had described in September of 1965, in the porch chair, built from cottonwood lumber, looking out over fields of wheat, and speaking about what it means to own something free and clear. Not the pride of having more than someone else. Not the satisfaction of having been proven right, though. The evidence for that was comprehensive. Something older than either of those things. Something that had to do with the relationship between a man and the ground he worked, and the obligation that relationship created, and the discipline required to honor that obligation. Through seasons that were easy, and through seasons that tested everything a man had. Earl had understood it. Walter understood it. Calvin was learning it in the way that understanding of this kind is learned, which is not from being told, but from doing the work across enough seasons that the work becomes a way of seeing. Dorothy found the note card in the kitchen drawer in the spring of 1990. She had been clearing out the drawer to make room for the new farm records Calvin was generating, reorganizing the accumulated paper of 40 years of household and farm management into something more orderly. The note card was in the back of the drawer, underneath everything else written in Earl's handwriting in a pencil that had gone faint with time. She stood at the counter and read it. Land paid. No man owns this but us. Earl had written it in 1943, the year he made the last payment on the original 160 acres, and walked out of the courthouse with a clean deed. He had put it in the kitchen drawer, and it had stayed there through 47 years, and one death and 2 generations of farming the same ground. Dorothy took the note card to the frame shop in Hayes and had it matted and framed simply without decoration, in the way of something that does not need ornamentation to be what it is. She hung it on the kitchen wall above the shelf where Walter kept his notebook. She did not tell Walter she was going to do it. He came in from the field one evening and it was there. He stood in front of it for a moment, reading the words he already knew in the handwriting he had not seen in 25 years. Dorothy was at the stove. She did not turn around. Walter took off his coat and hung it by the door and sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the framed card on the wall. He looked at the ledger Dorothy had made, which still sat on the shelf below the card, where it had been since she finished it in 1981. He looked at Calvin's field maps on the table, covered with the careful notations of someone learning to see what Walter had spent a lifetime learning to see. He looked at his notebook, which was almost full now, the same wire-bound kind he had always used, filled with 8 years of entries in the same handwriting, the record of 8 years of decisions made and kept, and the consequences of both. Outside the kitchen window, the machine yard was quiet in the evening light. The 3 rebuilt tractors sat where they always sat. Beyond them, the fields ran south and east to the horizon. 720 acres of ground that no bank had any claim on, that would pass to Calvin. And from Calvin to whoever came after, carrying with it the understanding that some things are worth the winters they cost, that promises made to dying men are worth keeping, that land earned by 1 generation can sustain 3, if the ones who hold it understand what they are holding. Walter opened his notebook to a fresh page and dated the entry. He wrote the yield figures for the fall harvest, which had been the best in 3 years. He wrote the cost figures for the season, which were consistent with what he had projected in the spring. He wrote a note about the 2 fence posts on the eastern boundary that needed resetting before the ground froze. Then he closed the notebook and set it on the table, and sat with his wife in the kitchen of the house his father had built in the quiet of a November evening in Ellis County, Kansas, and did not say anything because there was nothing left to say that the silence did not already contain.